My name is Kara Balog. I'm the watershed coordinator with the Shasta Valley Resource Conservation District. We do this forest stewardship workshop series in collaboration with the Siskiyou Land Trust. Sam Baxter, president, is here, and the Natural Resource Conservation Service to bring local and regional experts on forest, fire, and ecosystem health to your doorstep. We investigate and discuss topics ranging from the role of fire in our forest ecosystems to practical tools and methods landowners can use to improve fire resiliency and health of their forests. Tonight we'll be discussing the role and state of meadows in forest ecosystems and what's being done to restore these ecologically important spaces. Our objective here is to examine the facts, get informed about the science, and on-the-ground application of this science throughout South County. While this is not a debate, following presentations, we're going to have a question and answer session. So we encourage you to think about those questions throughout the 4 presentations. Think of questions for each of the presenters. I'm going to not do the cue cards because we have a smaller group than I thought we'd have, if that's okay. And we'll continue that after the presentation. So hold your questions. If you're afraid you're going to forget them, feel free to write them down, and then we'll do that after all of it. So we've got 4.5 maybe speakers, very interesting speakers here today. We've got Andrew Urso with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and Bob Hawkins is going to be his little minion for this speak.
I'm here for support.
Heidi George with the Shasta-Trinity National Forest. Randy Akana with General Services with the county, and Danielle Lindler with Jefferson Resources to speak to us today. So I'm going to first introduce Andrew, and then we'll start off with him. Andrew Urso is an environmental scientist for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife Timberland Conservation Program. His efforts focus on the Timber Harvest Plan Review for Siskiyou, Modoc, and parts of Trinity County. Born and raised in Portland, Oregon, Andrew received his Bachelor's of Science degree in Biology from Oregon State in 1998. His emphasis on study was cellular biology and chemistry. After a couple of years working in the lab for Oregon Health Science University, Andrew fulfilled his calling for working outdoors by joining the Arizona Department of Game and Fish in 2001, surveying for multiple endangered and threatened species throughout the state. After a few years of drying off in Arizona, he moved back to Oregon to conduct salmon and trout surveys along the Hood and Deschutes River for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And now he's here in California. So I'm going to turn it over to Andy.
I was wondering where that paragraph was. So, as was mentioned, I work for the Timberland Conservation Program for Department of Fish and Wildlife. And my main duty is to help other agencies review timber harvest plans that come into Siskiyou, Modoc, and Trinity County. Another thing that I do is I help foresters on species consultations and special projects such as Meadow Restoration. So I'd like to start off with the mission statement of the department. The mission of the Department of Fish and Wildlife is to manage California's diverse fish, wildlife, and plant resources and the habitats upon which they depend for their ecological values and for their use and enjoyment by the public. And that's what I am going to talk about today, is kind of the ecological role and biology of meadows and their importance in the forested landscape. And so this is a picture I took of a meadow out in Modoc, and I just kind of want to briefly touch on some aspects of it. We have a little bit of aspen here, the conifers kind of develop the edge. We have some down woody debris, and then kind of a stream that flows through. So it's kind of providing the water to the meadow. So it's a wet meadow. We have different types of grass species and plants, flowering plants. And then it just kind of goes from there. Insects, small mammals, large mammals, multiple bird species, and so on. So ecological role of meadows. So species diversity, that's kind of really what we're getting at. When, from a biologist standpoint, when we talk about the health of an ecosystem or a geographical region, species diversity really plays a role in defining the health. Basically, the more species we have, the healthier the system is. And the unique terrestrial and aquatic habitats found nowhere else in meadows. That's true. You know, that picture I showed you, you're not going to find that anywhere else but a wet meadow. So moderate water flow, increase late summer water storage, and filter water and improve water quality. So these are kind of hydrological functions of a meadow that I have a little diagram that I'll show in a bit. They also act as natural fuel breaks for wildfires because of their wetness and low fuel load. They can act as a fire break, fuel break. And obviously they're places of wild beauty. A lot of you like to hike and backpack. A lot of times a destination, a popular destination would be meadow. You know, sometimes it's high mountain lake, but you know, meadows are also destinations for backpacking. So I borrowed this slide off the internet, and I want to give credit to the Restoration Design Group for American Rivers. They used it in a conference for forest stewardship presentation. And I'm just going to briefly go over just a little bit of the functions of a wet meadow here and a healthy meadow. You know, you can kind of see the meandering, channelized stream that runs through it. This can hold multiple amphibian fish species, and then riparian vegetation for birds, small mammals, things of that nature. The groundwater and then bedrock and the soil here acts as a filter and a storage for water. And so that can help increase that late summer flow that I was mentioning. And then infiltration, when the water flows out, or you know, you have like a rain on snow event or whatever, or just rain, it also filters back down, recharging the groundwater. So I want to just kind of dive right into the species that depend on meadows. A lot of these are species of concern, threatened or endangered species that, as a department, we want to protect. And I took most of these pictures, so I don't have to give too many credits, but I will when I can. So, some examples of some species that depend on meadows: plants, grasses, shrubs, and forbs, insects, birds, amphibians, and mammals.
What's a forb?
It's like like a watery plant.
It's not a grass, it's not a shrub.
No,
Usually
yeah.
like broadleaves.
Yeah,
What?
broad leaves.
Broadleaf plants.
Yeah.
So like you'll see
Clover.
clover, dandelions, other herbaceous plants that aren't woody. Oh, but they're not grass.
Thank you. So foresters sometimes come to us and they want to do an Aspen restoration project. It's kind of tied in with the wet meadow restoration project as well. Aspen stands are highly associated with water courses, meadows, and open areas. So I guess these would be your forbs here and aspens, and then this is an edge of a meadow where there's some conifer encroachment. And we'll talk about conifer encroachment, but that's kind of the underlying theme of why we're losing meadows, and also some aspen stands. Conifers encroach on the aspens, block out the sun. So just a couple examples. This is a common camas Yeah, in the middle of a meadow. And then western Bisfort. These pictures, they were really high res, really big, so I just kind of isolated out just to give you an example. Butterflies, moths, and bees rely on flowers for pollen and nectar, and I'm sure everyone's well aware of how important pollination is. This picture I didn't take. I also borrowed this one online, but I couldn't find a credit. So many migratory and passerine birds use shrubs for nesting and foraging. So this is the state-listed endangered willow flycatcher. This is a picture my wife took of a couple nestlings in there, and then this is a stock photo. This is willows. So they nest in willow thickets. And this is actually along the Lake Siskiyou project that we'll be talking about. But you can see, I kind of covered it up, but there's some trees removed here, which is actually opening this up, which will allow for further growth of the willows. I haven't surveyed this area, but Siskiyou County, Shasta County is really a hotbed for these guys, and so the potential for them to be there is pretty high. So owls and raptors also use meadows, the edges of meadows. This is a great gray owl nest I found in Modoc County in 2011. This was the fledgling. And you can see, the nest, this is the very edge of the meadow. And you can see some gopher mounds and things where she was, there's a lot of gopher and squirrel heads found right here.
And that was also, I know this wasn't taken there, but we have them down at.
Yes.
Yeah, they're rumored to be down there. I did some surveys. It's difficult to survey for them down in this area because of the I-5 traffic tends to kind of make surveys difficult. Sandhill cranes, this is a fully protected species, and they will nest in the middle of the meadow, kind of they'll build a little platform where there's cooling water, but they also they just walk around and forage in meadows all day. Cascades frogs utilize streams and ponds in meadows. This is a species of special concern. There's a little bit of moving water kind of underneath this surface flow, and this is the same meadow I showed the very first picture. And this provides a perfect environment for the Cascades frogs. They also like to utilize high mountain lakes, but this is also another area where you can find them, especially South Siskiyou, Shasta County. So this is a picture of a gopher I took. I was sitting eating lunch one day, and I looked over, and he or she was excavating. So got a picture, and this you can see a little bit better. But these are some mounds just south of that area of the great gray owl. So they had ample feeding opportunity. Deer and elk use antelope forage in meadows. This was taken by Joe Coteau. Okay, so meadows in decline. This is a stat that I took off a paper. It was written in 2005. And basically California has more than 10,000 meadows totaling 300,000 acres. And that sounds like a lot, but there's 33 million acres of forested land in California. So meadows make up 1% of the forested landscape. So that's a really important concept to drive home here. They're very important, and there's just not that many of them. So threats to meadows, we spoke earlier about conifer encroachment. This is kind of one of the main issues, and it ties in very well with fire suppression. and I'll go into that in a little bit later, some slides. Water course manipulations, sometimes people will divert water or, put roads through meadows, and sometimes when you get the water diverting out of the meadow, you reduce the amount of water in the meadow, and then it ends up drying up, and then the soils change and things of that nature. Invasive species, if you bring in plants or insects or any kind of invasive species that isn't from that geographical region or ecosystem, and they're not really checked by predatory means, they can outcompete the grasses and the flowers and other animals in the meadow ecosystem. Climate change, I'm not going to go too much into this, but the idea is, every species prefers a certain temperature gradient. As global temperatures increase, the potential is there that these species may need to shift upslope or up the hill to meet that temperature demand. It would be easier for mammals and birds to do this if the habitat is there. Plants, not so much. That may pose a serious problem. And improper land use. It's kind of self-explanatory. Road building, development, mining, and recreational use in meadows. Okay, so talk a little bit about fire suppression and conifer encroachment. This is a picture taken in 1899 of the Yosemite Valley, and you can see some open areas right through here. In the late 20s, early 1930s, the Forest Service started implementing fire management policies. And so in 1961, you can see that the conifers have drastically encroached and reduced these meadows. This is another example, not as drastic, but you can see, you could probably ride a horse through that. The conifers there. This, not so much, it's very thick. You can see a little bit of wet grasses, wet meadow grasses. And they're gone here. That could be a number of reasons, grazing, but it's just interesting to know. This is another picture I took in South Warners. It's a pretty healthy meadow. You have a diverse plant and flower makeup. You got some shrubs, willows, aspen, and conifers. So it looks really good now, but if left unchecked, it's possible that these conifers can outcompete these aspen and encroach, block out the sun, change the soils, and then you're left with no more aspen. And I don't think I mentioned this, but aspen is a very rare, the quaking aspen in California is very rare, and we want to promote their persistence. So objectives for meadow restoration. Obviously, the most effective thing we can do is remove all the encroaching conifers, both merchantable and non-merchantable. So what I mean by that is foresters want some trees that they can sell, kind of offset the cost of restoring these meadows, and non-merchantable are small, emerging conifers, and so we want to remove all of them in the targeted area so they won't grow and outcompete for resources. And maintain and restore grass, shrub, and forb communities. This usually happens naturally after you remove the conifers. Sometimes the broadcast burning can be beneficial to kind of heat up the seed storage under the forest floor. And then depending upon your objectives and goals, sometimes you can actually plant some of the plants that you want to reintroduce to the area. And we did some of that on the coast. So improved hydrology, I spoke about that a little bit earlier. If you have the stream that kind of starts to divert or erode, you want to apply erosion, sediment, erosion measures so that you decrease sediment in the stream. Okay, so then I got to speed up a little bit. So we also use the forest practice rules. I don't know if anyone's heard of those, but those are the rules that foresters use in California that help guide their management. I just go through a couple. 895.1, the definition of a meadow. Meadows and wet areas include those natural areas that are moist on the surface throughout most of the year and or support aquatic vegetation, grasses, and forests as their principal vegetative cover. So once we identify that we have a meadow, then we can apply a special prescription, 933.4E, Aspen, Meadow, and Wet Area Restoration. And what we do in these areas, so all the trees in the aspen stands, meadows, and wet areas may be harvested or otherwise treated in order to restore, retain, or enhance these areas for their ecological value. I do want to note that sometimes we do leave legacy conifers and hardwoods that provide habitat elements like cavities and nests for wildlife. All right, so this is actually my last slide. It doesn't work, so let's see. There we go. So this is just a little movie of conifers coming in, and as you see them growing in, without fire and left unchecked, then you can see the aspen kind of get choked out. And this is a basic visual of what we're trying to prevent. And so that's all I have.
All right, so we'll hold off questions to the end. So I want to invite up next then Heidi George with the Shasta-Trinity National Forest with the Shasta McCloud Management Unit. She's spent 25 years with the Forest Service as a hydrologist, building resilience to disturbance through restoring natural processes and functions to small watersheds. She's got a Master of Science in Watershed Science from Utah State University and a Bachelor of Science in Geology from California State Universities, Chico and Humboldt. So I'll pull up your... And the way you move the slides forward is great.
Great. Well, welcome and thank you for coming. And I know that as you drove up here, you probably saw the signs, Heidi for Congress. You know, it's okay. I'm not running on a meadow platform.
Was that you?
Yeah. No.
Oh.
That's the joke. I'm sorry. So I am very fortunate to work for the Forest Service, and I work with a lot of great people that care a lot about the land. And this is one of the things that we try to do to put things back into some sort of sustainable order. So, dynamic disturbance is what we need. And so, yes, we have meadows with encroaching conifer, and we want to restore their processes and function. And those two words is what I'd like you to keep in mind. Also, if you could picture a meadow in your mind, and we'll go through this slideshow, and you can kind of apply some of the things that you might associate with when you think about that place. So to do the slides, I'm not sure how we're going to do this. Okay. So one of our objectives in the region that I work in, can everybody hear me? Okay. Is that we will be restoring degraded forest meadows to improve their habitat function and ability to hold water longer into the summer and deliver clean water when most needed. And I'm going to read something else that is, it's amazing when I think about that I get to work under this kind of a premise. Our leadership intent for this region is ecologically healthy and resilient landscapes, rich in biodiversity, will have a greater capacity to adapt and thrive in the face of natural disturbances and large-scale threats to sustainability, especially under changing and uncertain future environmental conditions such as those driven by climate change and increasing human use. And that's a tall order, as you can imagine. So, Karen and I will get into this here. We have many kinds of meadows, and some of the things that they share in common are openings, meadow openings. So think of that meadow that you have in your mind. Edges, meadows have edges. And then vegetation, we have a variety of vegetation depending on the meadow type. And then the hydrology. So, go ahead, Karen. So back to resilience. Having many kinds of meadows is a form of ecological resilience. So it's amazing to me. We have bogs and fens. We have wet meadows, dry meadows, aspen meadows, and we have vernal pools with their meadows. Go ahead. I'm a hydrologist. I'm going to look at meadows with more of a focus on hydrology and also their structure, why they are the way they are. Go ahead. So just to kind of get us in the same place, there's many sources that water can enter a meadow. And if you think about the elevation, water enters meadows from rainfall or snowmelt, groundwater moving through it, floodplain interaction, and hill slope runoff. And then water may hang in there for a while, or it may move slowly through the system. Okay. So these are bog meadows. These are Darlingtonia. They're carnivorous, insect-eating plant that provides protein in these poor soils that they tend to hang out in, serpentine soils. And then we have fens, and they're associated with groundwater upwelling. Bogs have very acidic soils. Fens range from acidic to alkaline, with a rich fen being more alkaline. So there's specific mosses that help us identify this is a fen and not a bog. And then we have vernal pools, and we know these as seasonal meadows, seasonally wet meadows, but we know they're vernal pools because they have a particular invertebrate or plant that is associated with these. So these dry up and they look like a meadow, and then spring runoff, snow melt, boom, you have water. And in this particular picture I'll show you, we have some transects here. This is White Deer Lake on the east side of the unit. And then we have an aspen stand. There's a gentleman in the audience, I won't mention his name, who I'm sure did a lot to make this happen. So, let's go ahead. Aspen meadows, they do require sunlight to reproduce. Aspen needs sunlight. We've been protecting aspen for years, thinking we were doing the right thing. And so the aspen started to really die out because they don't reproduce under shade. And they also, well, I'll get into more later, but we do have aspen meadows. This is the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And they came out and helped kind of guide us through some of our restoration plans and helped us understand more about the system. Okay. So I look at things through restoring meadows by restoring their processes and their functions. So every meadow is different. There's no single recipe for how you do something. The meadows you had in mind, I hope, you kind of thought about, well, yeah, we have openings, we have edges and boundaries. These are really rich and ecological significance, the boundaries. Landscape structure, over a large landscape, what do we see? And then hydrology is different, and the vegetation is different. So this is my only photo that I have to confess I got off it. Resilience to disturbance, what is it? It's the ability for a system to recover its processes and functions after a disturbance. That's what we want. We don't want the static thing that sits out there. And how we do that, we have meadows that experience wildfire, conifer encroachment, drought, and floods. And ways that we can build resilience is to increase fire frequency through treatment. That fire frequency will give us a less intense fire, shorter duration. And the first time we do it, it's not going to have the same response as the second and the third time, through time that we control it. Conifer encroachment, how do we address that? We want to take advantage of certain soil properties that meadows have. And to do that, we need to consistently remove young conifer. The soil properties tend to support meadow grasses. As conifer move in, it sets up a soil properties that encourage more conifer encroachment. And then, sunlight. We need more sunlight in those meadows. And then also, as Andy said, there's habitat in trees and conifer in large conifers, and perhaps they were there. They've been there for a long time. So I'm not saying to exclude all trees from meadows. That's maybe an expert might be able to be more informative about, really what is the right prescription for that particular meadow in that habitat. And then drought and floods. If we maintain vegetation, we'll have that grass that will provide moisture at depth. So let me rephrase that. Grass have long roots. They can sustain the vegetation in the meadow by bringing up that moisture from depth. And then also root strength and resistance to erosion. Grass have incredibly strong roots, and they go deep, and they can really prevent erosion, especially if there's any kind of surface water movement. So then looking at, these are sort of large-scale things, and then I'm going to get to actually applying them here. So landscape scale, 1%, that is the number that we're functioning off of as well. We are 1% of what we would have as a potential for that ecological type in the area. The recurrence interval of fire, where are we? 7 to 30 years recurrence interval is what we expect, and we're not there at all. Ecological diversity, fire does all kinds of things to increase the diversity in our systems. And then we have tree invasion or conifer encroachment. We do have aspen stands, and they're trees, and they invade, but we have so few aspen that we're encouraging that. So that's why I'm trying to select this. There's a lot of research done on tree invasion. So what will work for us here? And a lot of the controls on conifer encroachment have to do with how conifer moves into an opening. So it's very common for conifer to proliferate right along the edges, especially on those edges that have shade. So on the south side of the meadow, that shade will create a nice environment for conifer to start to become established. And as they move in, they develop a fungal-driven soil process, and that enhances more conifer to move in. So you have a cascading effect, just like in Andy's video. That's what we see. In addition, we have what's called nucleation, and that's where you may have a conifer that jumps out into the middle of this meadow, and then it starts to occupy that meadow. So you've got the edges of the meadow where the conifer are moving in, and then you have these little islands that you see. And meadows are, their soils are bacterial driven. They support a organic matter cycle that actually breaks down grass material more efficiently. And if you can keep that cycle going and your grass is healthy, you're able to more depend, have more resilience from conifer moving in. And here's my soil profile. This is at Trout Creek Meadow, and the thing that I learned about organic matter in meadows is that the grassroots actually bring in organic matter at depth. So with a bacterial-driven system, you'll see in a profile, you'll see a layer of darker organic rich matter in the soil profile. And this is in comparison to near-surface organic matter in a fungal conifer-driven soil system. And then, I think I mentioned this before, resilience to drought and flood. Meadow grasses have deep roots that can reach moisture and as well as dissipate runoff energy. They can resist erosion, maintain bank strength, and encourage stream and floodplain interaction. So just looking at this, I don't see this very often. This is at Bear Creek, and it's north of Gumboot Lake. So if you've been up in that area, and to be able to see a meandering stream with a good, well-established vegetation along the banks tells me a lot. It says that when there's a lot of water that comes through the system, it can handle it. It's going to spill that water out onto the floodplain, and there may be a little bit of erosion, there may be a little bit of deposition, but it is not going to cut down. It's not going to cut down, lower the water table, and drain that meadow. It's going to maintain the groundwater and the water table in that meadow. Here's a location map of, I don't have where the forest boundaries are on here because we're checkerboard with private land, public land, and private land. So what that means is the railroad came, you can know that story, the railroad lands are private lands now. So in between you'll see areas that have really straight boundaries. But on this map, you can see I've outlined some meadows. And these are the meadows that we have restoration projects on right now. And Panther Meadow, up on the mountain. And then this is Mud Creek Meadow and the associated meadows there. Trout Creek, Elk Flat, we're working on this project right now. White Deer Lake, and then Hambo and Aspen Meadow. That's it. Okay, so the person who is also in this room, and I won't mention their name, was pretty significant in making this happen. This is a great Aspen conifer overstory removal project. The conifer were removed. This is in, I believe, I'm going to forget. Can anybody throw a date when they think this might have happened? Maybe it was like 2008. And this is 2012. So what we see is there's no young aspen through here. And here, over here, there's quite a bit. It looks great now. So that the thing about aspen is they need light disturbance, and that stimulates the hormones that cause them to send out suckers and reproduce. Heavy disturbance is too much, but slight disturbance will help get that hormone going. And often just removing the conifer is enough. But then we have some other objectives, and we may go through and do some broadcast burning as well. We have the Mud Creek Meadow Restoration Project. Mud Creek mud flow was very active over, this is by McLeod, it was very active from 1924 to 1930. And this aerial photo is a 1944 aerial photo, and this is 2012. And you can see that, I thought this would show up a little better, but there's a brown outline right here. There's several meadows, and there's one right in there. So this is Mud Creek Meadow, and I'll be showing you some photographs of that. So keep in mind what this looks like in the next slide. So here is a mud flow. So that last slide had quite a bit of fine material that came down, but this is the upper portion of it. And this is the source of the Mud Creek mud flow. This is Mud Creek. Go ahead. And here's Aspen coming in, meadow invasion. You've seen that, those kinds of slides. And we're using prescribed fire. This Mud Creek meadow was burned, grass grew back, and we still didn't get enough conifers removed, and we just actually had another broadcast burn last year. So, go ahead. And then Panther Meadow, one of our favorite places to work. And this is a high elevation meadow, glacial material from moraines, kind of created a basin where fines collected, and then we have springs up there that keep the water flowing through the system. I'm just going to keep popping slides. This is the Panther Meadow project. If you want to know more about it, give me a call. If you have any high elevation projects like this, I love talking about it. Keep going. That's our end result. Looking good. And Trout Creek, we have dry meadows, wet meadows. This is a system that was probably constructed by glacial dust deposits, wind-blown glacial dust. And conifer have just completely encroached this, and you can see this doesn't really work for this meadow system. These trees rotate right out of the banks.
May I ask a quick question? On that last slide, was that cutting it because of the lack of grasses to maintain the stability, or is that natural for that type of meadow?
It's not natural, and I'll talk about it more later if you like. Yeah, it's not. This is what it should look like. So we had a harvest, we had a broadcast burn, and that's what it looked like years later. Just keep going. This is my favorite project right now, White Deer Lake, 2005. This was harvested, burned, and keep going. This is a seasonally wet meadow or a vernal pool. And there's the burn. We're going to do another burn this year or next year. And process and functions seem to be pretty darn restored, but you got to maintain them. You go out there every year and we remove those conifer. So go ahead. So the take-home point is it's not always as simple as what you think. It is complex. This is what it looks like when there's no water. Most years. Thank you.
You can hold the rest of your questions now. I'm going to invite Randy Akana, the Director of General Services for the County of Siskiyou, which oversees the following departments: Flood Control, Water Conservation District, Siskiyou County Power Authority, Communication Department, Stage and Airports Department, Solid Waste Department, Courthouse, and Ground Maintenance Department, so pretty much everything. He's worked with the county for about 14 years, 6 as the department head. He grew up in Siskiyou County and then left after high school to spend time in the military. Went to college, received a Bachelor of Science in Manufacturing Engineering from Chico State. has worked as a commercial pilot, as an engineer in aerospace in the semiconductor industry, and after 20 years decided to return back to Siskiyou County to raise his family in the beautiful environment he grew up in. And I also want to invite up here Danielle Lindler. They're going to be presenting together. She is a registered professional forester, pest control advisor, and CEO with Jefferson Resource Company, which is an environmental consulting firm with offices in Siskiyou and Humboldt. She's got over 20 years of experience working with forests, and where her focus has been forest ecology, management, and policy in California. She's been awarded numerous awards for her efforts, including the Conservation of the Year by the State Forestry Association, and she's got a Bachelor of Science in Forestry with a minor in Environmental Ethics, and has been a resident of Siskiyou County for the past 16 years. So I'm going to invite both of them up here. So if the two of you want to just go through the... yourselves. Just advancing slides, it's just this button right here.
Okay, well, thank you, Kara. I really do appreciate it. It's always, for me, great to come into these audiences and see the diversity of not only the people that we speak with, but the projects that we take on. As you heard from Kara, I do a lot. There's a lot on my plate. And we take all these projects very seriously, and it's important for us to remember that we're serving you guys. You're the people, and that is foremost on my mind. But I also have to follow rules and regulations. So I just want you to think about that as I'm going to the presentation. And I hope at the end, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. So one thing I wanted to cover on first of all is I thought it was important for everyone to really know who oversees Lake Siskiyou. Because I get a lot of questions, oh, it's the county, it's the county. It is the county, but it is also a portion of the county, which is called the Siskiyou County Flood Control and Water Conservation District. This district, which is a portion of the county, was created in September of 1956 as part of the Upper Klamath River Basin Compact. Then in 1966, there was property acquired by the county or the flood control district, and a dam was created to create Lake Siskiyou. The flood control district is really a separate entity from the county in some ways. It has its own governing board, it has an executive director, it runs off its own budget, and it has to follow its own rules, its own ordinances and policies. So there's a lot of things that are specific and unique to the Siskiyou County Flood Control District. In the late 90s, the Flood Control District, once they acquired this project, realized how important it was to them to manage the forests and to make sure that there's got to be some way that we've got to take care of this. They were seeing a lot of this disparity in the forest, the forest fires and the diseases and the bugs, and the powers that be got together and said, hey, we've got to do something here. So in 2002, they moved forward with the development of what we call the NTMP. And the NTMP stands for Non-Industrial Timber Management Plan. And it is a 100-year plan that allows you to manage property that you have with the goal, in this particular case, to manage the health of the forest and also recreation, because that's a huge recreational area, and to make sure that there's as much diversity in that as you can possibly get. And that is a challenge, because as I'm sure many of you are here, utilize Lake Siskiyou, you see the use down there, and it is tremendous when it comes to diversity. So we hired all these professionals, because we didn't have a lot of professionals on staff. We hired biologists and engineers and geologists and botanists and everything else, and they got together and worked on this. And then finally in August of 2005, there was a plan approved, and it went out to public comment. I came in about 2004 on this project. I remember going out on tours. We had tours and buses, and we took people out. We looked at the ground. We talked about the process. We talked about what was going to happen, and we spent a lot of time and effort to make sure that we had a lot of input from not only these professionals here, but also from you folks. This particular plan covers about 1,500 acres, and at Lake Siskiyou, there's just over 2,200 acres. So there's a little portion of it that it does not cover, and we're sitting on it right now, which is the resort. As you can imagine, being an entity, we are governed by many, many regulations. We've got boating and waterways, we've got all these different types of things with dams and water resources, the Water Control Board, waste discharge permits, you can see. I won't name them all, but there's a lot. The important one for us, one of the very important, is the NTMP, because that really is, for me, as an overseer of this project, it's the rule book for me. It's what I really need to follow. All these other agencies sort of come in. And believe it or not, there's overlap, and some of it conflicts with each other. So we have to try to figure all that out. Davis Grunsky, they were huge in this project. They put up a few $1 million to make this whole project happen out there. When I say the project, I mean the dam and the Lake Siskiyou. And of course, as was mentioned, we have Siskiyou Power Authority, we have a power plant, a couple power plants in the dam that generate power, so we have those folks we have to comply with. So our goal, and then we're going to start to go into the meadow, is we need to comply with the regulations and the rules and everything that's in the NTMP. We need to continue to meet all the requirements for our agencies. We meet with them, we talk about what's going on, what do we want to do because of the diversity and the dynamics of that forest out there. A lot of things happen. I mean, there's bugs out there, we've got use over here, we've got things happening over here, and it changes. So we still have to follow the plan, but we continually work with our agencies. And our real goal is to develop a health and safety forest and meadows for future generations, because I hope you would agree that for this portion of the California, it's a very, very important place to be. So with that, I'm going to let Danielle talk a little bit more about some of the real nuts and bolts, and then we may jump back and forth.
So hello, I'm Danielle Lindler, and I'm a registered professional forester and pest control advisor. And I'm not sure if anybody's, besides maybe a few RPFs in the audience, knows what an RPF is, but a registered professional forester is unique to the state of California. In order to obtain this license, it's a state license, you have to have a minimum of 7 years of education and experience. It's a 3-year apprenticeship program post-college. The forestry programs in the state usually take about 5 years to get through. So for me, I had 8 years before I was qualified to take the exam. We study such things as environmental law, obviously forest, botany, statistics, hydrology, soils, wildlife, fisheries, fire ecology, insects disease. Pretty much it's a very holistic major. We don't just look at trees. And my emphasis was forest engineering and ecology. So anyway, so that's a little bit about what an RPF is, because I know many aren't familiar with that. So the goals of the NTMP, and my company, which formerly was called Berryman and Associates, was hired by Siskiyou County in 2003. We are now, as of 2006, we incorporated and we changed our name to Jefferson Resource Company. Anyways, we were hired to write the non-industrial timber management plan, which I have here, for the county. And this is the document. You can find it online at the county website. And the document lays out a plan for the management of the surrounding properties owned by the flood control district, as far as what's going to happen in the immediate future, this first 10-year decade from when the plan was approved. And we also model how, with our manipulation of the forest resource, how those resources change through time. And our time frame that we look at and are required by law to look at it is a 100-year planning horizon. Now, the document is good for the life of the landowner, i.e. the county, so it will need revisions over time. But the main goals that the Board of Supervisors in 2003, 2004, when we started to write the plan for the NTMP was, they had 5. Is a promotion of wildlife diversity. We've decided to achieve that through diversity of habitats. We did an oak restoration project up off of Castle Lake Road, and then the meadow, which we'll talk about. There was a large concern for the reduction of fire, especially in the campground. This last year we did implement a fuels reduction. If anybody's been through the campground, you can actually see the lake from the campground. And that was because, if you can imagine, on any given weekend you have 3,000 occupants, plus or minus, in that campground with flaming marshmallows and barbecues and the whole bit. It is a huge liability for the county, as well as the concessionaire and the health and safety of the occupants of the campground. As well as forest health, we do have some insects and diseases that are quite prevalent around Lake Siskiyou. Currently, you'll actually, throughout Siskiyou County, you'll start to notice, South Siskiyou County that is, you'll start to notice some treetops dying. We're starting to have issues with ips. It's a engraver beetle. It goes in the top of the trees and bores down. It lays its larvae underneath in the cambium, and it will kill 10 to 20 feet of the tops of trees. And we do have that going on around Lake Siskiyou. So promotion of forest health, because we want to keep our forest green, especially around Lake Siskiyou. The county had asked that all of our projects be cost effective, which is hard, especially in this economy. And then there was aesthetics considerations, because it is a recreational area. And areas like your Cable Beach, where there's a new parking lot, and the trails that go through there, that was all harvested in, what was it, 2008, 6, 8, somewhere. But that was kind of, that area through there is kind of what we're going for, if you've been through to that parking lot, as far as aesthetics. So the NTMP, real quickly, I'm going to run through these. Wildlife habitat was a main focus of the NTMP. It contains provisions to restore the meadows, as I'm sure many of you have seen, for creating gaps, and to keep forest development in all stages present on the property. This will maximize the edge effect, and which will then benefit the most number of species, and also maintain early sterile brush, which is important for certain animals like deer for forage. We do have policies in the NTMP for retention recruitment of large trees. We definitely want a large tree element out there at Lake Siskiyou. There's not a lot of down woody debris out there, large logs in some of the forested stands. So in areas where it's not a hazard to, say, the immediate trail, we do have a policy written into the plan, which coal logs we will be returning out into the forest landscape for fishers, rodents, etc., for habitat. We're planning on doing stream improvement in the plan, as well as introducing large woody debris into Lake Siskiyou for western pond turtle habitat, fishery habitat, because as you'll see in a second, there wasn't much structure in the lake prior to the dam. So, North Shore Road, where the meadow is, that we restored, we're in the process of restoring, is under agreement with the Siskiyou County Flood Control District and the Department of Fish and Game, now the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And they had an agreement back in 1983 that says the entire North Shore Road area, is about plus or minus 500 acres, will be managed for deer habitat. That was a mitigation for the loss of habitat that was inundated with the lake. So that entire area this agreement guides the management of that entire area, hence the necessity for the restoration of that meadow. And this is a report to the Fish and Game Commission. It's an assessment of mule and black-tailed deer habitat. It's a real good synopsis that we've used on how to manage for deer. And one of the things that we know about deer is that they need forage, and most of their forage species are sun-loving plants. They need young succulent brush and forbs, grasses, etc. All of those species of forage need full sunlight. And what this graph shows is that as you increase the canopy, and this is tree canopy, this would be where no sun is hitting the forest floor, you get a drastic decrease in herbaceous material. And again, it's because as you add more shade to the landscape, those sun-loving plants now don't fit in that new habitat, if you will. So this is Lake Siskiyou. This is a 1951 photo prior to the lake. And this boundary, the red boundary, is the non-industrial timber management plan boundary, which for the most part coincides with the ownership of of the county. And this yellow line is where we just harvested this fall. So this would be the campground. This is, Speedy Meadow. This is up Castle Lake Road. And then all this ground in here, you can see there was existing meadow, is now inundated with the lake. Let's see. And there's a zoom in of the meadow. And it's kind of grainy. I apologize, it's an older photo. This is a 1990s version. I believe this was 97 aerial photo. For those that have been in the county long enough, you'll remember when we had the big windstorm and it blew down all the dog cone and broke out tops all over WA Bar Road. And so that's that. You can see the campground. Again, you can start to see a few conifers. These darker areas are conifers starting to encroach in the meadow. And now we do have the lake. And then again, a blow up of the 97 photo of the meadow. And then we jump to 2012. And you can see we have had a lot of forest encroachment. And the reason being is, as you've heard other speakers talk about, is our forests in the Cascades, and especially the Sierra Nevadas, are fire-rich environments. We had a fire interval of every 5 to 30 years on average in our forests. That would go through and thin out the underbrush, thin out the trees. On average, we had about 60 to 80 trees historically per acre. Now, in a lot of these stands, we have 300 to 800 trees per acre. So the forest has encroached, and you can see, in the next slide I do a comparison, you can see even in the meadow how the trees are growing in there. And then there's a close-up of the trees that are in the meadow. And this is a comparison. And what I'll show you here is if you look at, this is just north of Lake Siskiyou. The lighter is bare ground brush. Through here, this is Castle Lake Road. You can see most of this is brush, with the darker green being just a few trees. Now compare those points. This is almost all timber, just north of the campground. This is that same area as you drive up Castle Lake Road, and then the meadow. So we've definitely suppressed wildfire, and it's had a consequence of encroaching our meadows. And then there's a 51 to 2012 of the meadow. So in 60 years, you can see we've had quite an encroachment. And then this is a great photo from Randy. He just flew over. This is last week. This is the Meadow Restoration. You can see we left a few trees out there for perch trees, etc. There's a direct over the top. This is primarily willows. There are a few aspen out there as well, but this is willow flycatcher habitat that we try to leave intact. And then, and then one other thing I wanted to show you. Thank you, if you wouldn't mind. And then one other thing I want to show you. In the forest practice rules, we're required to leave what they call a watercourse lake protection zone. And since this is what we would consider a class 1 watercourse, or lake rather, because it has fish, class 1 meaning fish bearing, depending on the slope, we would have to leave a buffer that we typically would be able to harvest in. But to maintain the riparian function and to kind of err on the side of caution for any potential erosion that could have happened, even though it's flat ground, erosion hazard is very low out in the meadow. But we wanted to err on the side of caution because it is Lake Siskiyou. We left an unharvested buffer along there. Oh yeah, thank you. So the next one, and that's again the Meadow Restoration. You can see we've tried to burn off some of the needles. They keep going. And the reason is because we had about 40 years accumulation of pine needles underneath the stands. The trees were primarily ponderosa pine. They were 35 to 40 years old. You can see I've got that little chubby fingers there on a tree that's 27 years old at the stump. So those trees were growing really fast, and the reason is they had full sunlight, which ponderosa pine as a species needs full sunlight, and it had all of the water that it needed because it's out in the middle of a meadow. And so when trees are not water stressed, they can grow very fast. And we know you can tell how fast a tree is growing by measuring rings per inch. And on average, this was about 1.5 to 2 rings per inch. And for the foresters in the room, you know those trees are growing very fast. They were jumping out of the ground, as we'd say. They average about 45 feet tall. And they did have some disease. They were starting to get hit with western gall rust, which is a fungus that typically affects fast-growing pine. And it creates these like cankers on the branches. And then it also was hit with diplodia. And for those that have been around the lake, you'll see diplodia. We still have it out there where the branches will kind of look like a broom, and then the needles turn gray. And it's a fungal blight that is spread. And the only way to reduce the effect of that fungal infection is to amputate, and it's hardest. So things that we considered with restoring the meadows was the timing. Because it is a recreational area, we knew we have parameters of when we do not operate at the Lake Siskiyou, which is after Labor Day and before Memorial Day. So all of our operations out there would be after September, but typically even into October, it would be the earliest because there's still, we found that September to October window is still a little dicey as far as the number of recreationists, and then before Memorial Weekend. And that's especially on North Shore Road. Another consideration is we wait till the plants nest, meaning we waited till, we would not go out into that meadow when everything is green and just starting to sprout, because you would disturb this year's seed source. So we waited till everything is to nest, and then went and harvested, and we waited till the soils were dry because we wanted to keep our soils intact. We hired a local logger, which is CLT Logging. If anybody knows Tristan and Monette Allen, they're from Montague. And then the wood is sold as chips for biomass, and then there was a few loads of actual logs. We did retain some trees in the meadow for aesthetics, as well as perch trees for birds, etc. And then the trees, again, had the rust and the diplodia. And then stump removal. I know there's been a large public concern about the visualization of the stumps. We did try to get those stumps as low as possible. That was one of the recommendations when we hired the logger, was to cut them off as flush as you can. He actually went through several different heads on his equipment because he was hitting rocks and dirt, which is not typical. I don't know if you guys noticed some of the stumps in like the Heidi's presentation or Andrew's, but the stumps, were 18, 20 inches tall. Ours, because we knew there would be a visual, we did try to get them as low as possible. However, there's limitations with equipment and etc. So as far as actually removing those stumps out of the ground, we did consider that, but the reason we decided not to was because removing those stumps would leave depressions in the soil, as well as removing those stumps would turn over potential seed sources of seeds that we don't want exposed. And then you could have a invasive species problems, et cetera, et cetera. So we advocated against that. And let me back up real quick. One other Fish and Game with Joe Courteau was consulted 100% in all meadow activities. Him and I went back and forth because he is, in a sense, the lead agency on everything that goes on out in that meadow. And he also agreed about that. It's very expensive to go out there and grind the stumps, remove the stumps, and the project was already a cash negative project because this type of work, this restoration type of work is expensive, for lack of a better way to say it. The pine stumps, especially because those trees were growing fast, they will decay faster than most other tree species. And as they decay, there'll be crevices, which will actually be additional diversity for rodents, bats, etc. And let's see, is there another slide? And then this is some of the work. One of the things we did, this is a Timco. We whole tree yarded on purpose, which means we didn't cut the branches off after the tree was immediately on the ground. And the reason is if we were to cut these branches off, you're going to have rutting of this heavy bowl of that tree running through the meadow. So these branches kind of act like a spring, if you will, and kind of help keep the weight of that bowl. So we whole tree yarded. Thanks. And there he is, actually whole tree yarding. Thanks. And then what we did is we brought all those trees with the branches on back to a central location, de-limbed them, cut them up so that they would be either ready to be chipped, and then it was sold to Roseburg for the biomass facility for green energy, or for wood products, they use the wood for plywood, of course. And then here's the meadow post-operations. You can see we've made attempts with the Deadwood crew to go out and try to rake up the needles. That's one of our biggest issues right now. Pine needles are very acidic, and they impede the growth of grasses and forbs. So we are trying to remove those. Next. Here's another picture of the meadow. Again. And then here it is again, post. And right now, this is, it's a visual disturbance. But when we manage forests, we don't look at just, we're trained not to just to look at the today. When you looked at Heidi's photos, a lot of those restored meadows were 6-8 years later. And I hope from looking at her photos and to kind of see what this will go towards, we do recognize it's a visual, because anytime you have change, it's a consideration. But just knowing with other projects that have been done around the county that this too shall change and go towards what we want it to be, which is a full functioning meadow. So. And then I'll let Randy talk about what the county has planned for future.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, you've seen a lot of activity out there, and we're going to continue to remove especially invasive weeds. We're going to be working with the Fish and Wildlife Group, their botanists and biologists, and getting a plan set up to do our best to maintain the weeds out there. That's going to be a real top priority for us, to make sure we don't have start those invasive weeds coming into the meadow, so the meadow can restore itself. We are going to try to continue to burn needles. We'll see how it progresses. We're going to get surveys from the botanists and biologists. They're going to come out and take a look at how the meadows is restoring itself. And we're not going to try to force the meadow to restore. We're going to, at this point, we're going to allow the meadow to restore itself, because that's what it does best. And if we find that there's something going on out there that does not meet our criteria or the criteria in the NTMP, we have a problem, then we can get involved. But our goal is really to just let the meadow restore. Oh boy, let's see, what else are we going to do? We're going to be working with CAL FIRE, and we do have a lot of the work with the inmates. They come out, so they're a great resource for us to do a lot of handwork out there, because most of the work we're going to do is handwork. We're not going to be spraying or anything like that. Pretty much everything we'll be doing will be by hand. Oh, let's see. And we're going to establish a public users program in and around the meadow. In other words, because of the diversity of that area, it's important for us to make sure that we can utilize the meadow in the ways that we can. As I'm sure many of you know, the fireworks folks work out there. They use that little peninsula there in the corner, and they're going to be out there again this year. Historically, they've cut across the meadow, and they've had fire trucks and tractors and everything else, but we're pulling them off the meadow this year. In fact, we're getting ready to put in a new restroom out there, a double restroom, concrete restroom, and we're going to be pulling the road out onto the side. So we're going to be doing everything we can to keep traffic off that meadow so we can allow it to restore. We have weddings, requests for weddings, and that sort of thing out there. And I think it's good to have that. You know, we've talked with the supervisors and the overseers, and they agree that, again, this area is for you guys, it's for the people. So it's an opportunity to allow you to use it in the most diversified way that we can, yet still maintain our goals of keeping a diverse wildlife and forested meadow. That's going to be this next year, that's what we're working at. So we've got one more, we've got sort of a long-year plan, and Kira's working on it. Still working on it.
Sorry.
I guess we don't.
Oh, wait, I think it was that one. Okay.
Okay, so.
I think some of this is.
Oh, yeah, I was saying, so anyway, the meadows are not, or the meadow is not just Steny Point. We have a North Shore meadow, and we have what we call a Delta meadow. There's really 3 established meadows on that North Shore area. I've been asked the question, well, what are you going to do in the next meadows? When are you going to go out there? What's going to happen? Well, we're watching those other meadows, and we are going to be managing those in the most efficient and economical way that we can. Right now, we don't have any plans to do any significant work other than just looking at those meadows and going into them. If we start to see some conifers coming up, we may hand pick a few. But other than that, right now, we're just sort of keeping an eye on it. We're not going to be out there doing anything of real significance. And of course, we do get a lot of people that want to live out there because it is a beautiful area. Unfortunately, it creates a lot of problems for us. They have camps, they have burning and everything else. So we have law enforcement out there as much as we can to try to persuade them to go into Forest Service land. Or somewhere else. Because we want to keep those meadows as pristine as we can. We want you to use them, we want you to be out there, but we don't want that to be your residence. So that's about it for me.
Yeah. Okay.
So if Heidi and Andrew and maybe Bob come up, we can ask some questions back and forth. Just take it from there.
And then I have some before and after photo series, or that photo series that I showed up there from 1951 to 2012. If you guys want to study them, I've got 2 sets of those photos, so I can pass those around. So, okay, questions?
Anybody can answer this. Do you consider that a wet meadow or a dry meadow?
The dry meadow. The soils are fairly permeable out there. There are wet spots where there's depressions, but a lot of it is, I would say, on the drier side because of the soil type is very permeable.
So that actually is part of the old Rainbow Ranch, is that right?
Mm-hmm. It is part of the old ranch.
And what was it when the ranch was there? You know?
I don't know, but as far as if it was conifer before, I haven't seen any stumps out there, part of the ones we just created, which would be indicative of past agricultural clearing. And, you know, that they, even historic stumps that would, you know, be 80 to 100 years old, sometimes you see them still kind of like crushed and depressions. I haven't seen any of those out there. So if it was a meadow, maybe Rich Fluke knows from your work, I don't know. But if it was forested, it would have been over 100 years ago, if it was. But I don't know. I don't have that history.
So what if it had been forested and cleared for hay harvesting?
Okay.
Which they did a lot of on that ranch. So sometimes it was pastured, sometimes they harvested hay. And if they're running agricultural equipment on it, yeah, they pull the stumps.
Yeah, they could have. They could have. The other thing, though, to keep in mind is even if it was forested, while forests are important to deer, especially because that's a deer mitigation area, Well, forested landscapes are important for, bedding and other aspects. Meadows are also important for forage. And you got to think of it as kind of a bed and a breakfast. They need a kitchen too. And you can't just have one habitat element and expect to manage for a diversity of species. I mean, that'd be like having everybody here live in a studio with no bedroom, no bathroom, no kitchen. And that's basically what we have or would have if we were to allow natural succession to continue, is that entire North Shore Road would be forested. When we know historically, even if this was an agricultural meadow, let me see, I got it upside down. Even if this was an agricultural meadow, you can see we've lost a lot of open space up on the hillside and the flanks of Rainbow Ridge, because that's what it looks like today. And there is no forage under there. It's getting to the point of what we would consider a depauperate understory, meaning basically the only thing in that understory is sticks and twigs because there's not enough sunlight hitting that forest floor. And so in a sense, there is no kitchen. So we're creating a kitchen for the deer.
Well, that's well and good. When you call it restoration, what are you restoring it to?
Yeah.
You're restoring this to what the Siskiyou Ranch was. You're not restoring it to what was there before then.
Well, we don't
They
know
altered
that.
the landscape when they settled there.
Yeah,
They
but we
altered
don't
the
know that.
landscape in order to run a farm and ranch there.
Yes.
So you're restoring this to what the Siskiyou Ranch was,
But-
rather than what there was before that.
Let me interrupt you real
So when
quick.
we talk about restoration, that's the restoration.
Well, we don't know that it wasn't. A lot of the agricultural areas initially started in open meadows and then cleared adjacent because they're going to take, our pioneers took the path of least resistance.
Or where there was
And I know
water.
that because I'm 5th generation native Californian and my family did that. My family, some of the founding fathers of Butte County. And that's what my family did. So they're not going to go and just, take an area and wipe out, let's see, I'm going to guess that's probably 200 to 300 acres of what would have been woodland. I mean, that's a lot of work, and especially if you're considering it was 100, 150 years ago, you're considering they didn't have heavy equipment. I would agree that they probably expanded the edges of an existing meadow, but they took advantage of what was there.
You guessed.
Well, you're guessing as well.
Yes, I agree.
Yes.
It's unknown.
It is unknown. But we do know meadow habitat, as it currently exists in Lake Siskiyou and our surrounding forests in California, is a limiting factor.
You don't have to argue with me about that. Thank you.
Well, I'm not arguing, I'm just stating the
All right,
facts.
how about up here?
I have a question. So, Heidi, and I'm sorry. Yes. So when you talk about the percentage of meadowland that we had in California, let's just look at Siskiyou County or this bioregion right here. What percentage? Compared to what if it were the natural state? What's the difference right there of? Because I know you had said 1%.
Yeah, 1% is what I have read in the literature.
1% of what the meadows used to be just in this area?
Of the area, so
Or
the total area of this area, and I think it is
Well,
true in the Sierra
yeah.
Nevada as well.
Yeah, the way I read it was 1% of all of the forested area in California. So not the whole area of California, but all the
Right.
forested land.
But I'm assuming
On our
it used to be
forest.
a different ratio. So what did it, can we imagine it historically used to be?
Right, so if it's 1%, of what it used to be, then, and the other 99%, that would mean there was a lot.
You mean, was it
Okay,
like
I-
10 or 20% or something?
Yeah,
That I
yeah.
don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
That I don't know, but I know it was most likely higher than 1%.
From what I learned in school, and I went to Humboldt State, there was about 10% old growth of the 33 million acres plus or minus that we have of timber in California. There was about 10% of it was in old growth, 10% of it was in meadow, and the rest was kind of a mixed conifer. So we've lost as much, we've lost a lot.
I'm
of that.
sorry, now I'm with you.
Yeah. But no, it was.
Yeah, but, right, so we have Total acres right now, that's a really good question, and I can't give you the answer. But I do know that we have, 2,000 acres right now that we're looking at. 40% of what it is right now is maybe meadow. So, and I know that the research that Oregon State, I think it was Oregon State did, is we're 50% of that forested area. So that's a huge management objective, yeah.
So Bruce, and then we'll do John afterwards.
You had the gully question in Trout Creek, yeah.
All the presentations were really fascinating, just wanted to say. On Andrew's first presentation talking about threats to meadows, I was surprised there wasn't any talk of grazing as a threat.
Yeah.
You did mention invasive species, but I don't know if you meant that counts as invasive species, but I've seen in places in Siskiyou County, like the Marble Mountains Wilderness, where there's beautiful meadows trampled down by cows, grazed by cows, and it seems to me it's...
Yes, and I was going
But it's
to,
still a meadow.
I was going to mention,
It's just a grazed meadow.
I was going to talk about that. But overgrazing, grazing does have a potential, if it's overgrazing, to have an impact on the meadow. Sometimes, there's a certain percentage, I'm not quite sure what that is, I think 1 head per 1.5 acres or something, and that replaces that herbivory, and that can actually be beneficial and be okay. So there's a fine line, but I will agree that, overgrazing definitely has a negative impact.
A couple of people talked about encroachment of conifers. That seems to me to be a natural function. You've got moraine and the glacier pushed down and slows the water down, it drops the sediment, and fills up like Mirror Lake. There's not a lake there anymore. It's filled up with sediment, and so you've got soil, and then you've got water, and some trees are going to want to come in.
Yes.
So are we sort of fighting something inevitable here?
Well, no, because historically you would have fire that would manage that encroachment. So fire would come in and kind of wipe out the smaller trees, and then they would have to start all over again. So that the conifer encroachment fire was kind of the...
Yeah, some of the greater mechanisms for maintaining meadow are actually like burrowing animals. So the gophers actually maintain those meadow soils and keep disturbance happening. And then with fire and gophers, I didn't talk about gophers, but gophers are big in maintaining meadows. It's always keeping that meadow at a small conifer stage. And when fires went through, they were efficient. So we lost that efficiency. And yes, they do slow down the forest fires slow down at meadows, but they probably really crossed the meadows because they were grassy. And then we had elk that kept the grass down, the ungulates that also kept the grass down. Maybe they ate a little conifer. I don't want to put that into the mix, but I'm just saying I don't know. That may be part of it. And so here we are in this, 1% of what we were. And there's something happening, and the biggest thing has to be wildfire, lack of wildfire. So I would think of that kind of a disturbance mechanism that's missing from our maintaining our meadows that needs to be replaced.
I have a bunch of questions. I'm willing to stagger them. When I look at my own land and I look at the land on the way to Reading, I see a lot of oak. So what do you mean by oak restoration?
Oak, again, is a sun-loving tree. And natural succession is that the oak's established after a disturbance. And then conifer, usually more shade-loving conifer, like a fir, white fir, Doug fir, where it will start to grow in its understory and then grow up through the oak, shade out the oak, and now there's no more oak. So what we do, and oak are very important for deer, squirrels, because they're what we call a mast crop species, M-A-S-T crop, which is a fancy way of saying that the acorns are extremely important for the wildlife. So that's what we mean by oak restoration, is we remove the conifer and left the oak, because that habitat element around Lake Siskiyou is not in abundance. So that's what we did.
Is legacy conifer and oak a synonym for indigenous or what?
No. A legacy tree means just basically a tree that is, just real simple, it wasn't a tree that we cut down. So it's just a legacy tree is a tree from the stand. A stand is a group of trees. So it's a tree or a group of trees that was there from the original stand prior to harvest. So we're leaving little clumps. And typically we leave these individual trees or clumps of trees for added structural diversity for wildlife. So.
Okay, is that then kind of synonymous with old growth or?
No.
not either.
Old growth trees are, there's a whole definition of what an old growth tree is, but typically like the purest sense of what an old growth tree is it's a tree that's senescing into its later time lifespan. So just like all biological organisms have a lifespan, depending on the species of tree determines on when it gets to be old growth. So like what I mean by that is like a dog would be considered old growth at 12 or 14. Hardly could say a human is old growth at 12 or 14. Tree species are the same thing. So like you could have old growth knobcone pine at like 60, 80 years old, or you could have old growth ponderosa pine at 200, 300 years old, because they're at the end of their lifespan.
Okay.
So.
If somebody else wants to ask a question, I'm willing to wait.
Yeah.
If I may, okay. I'm going to kind of bundle my questions together. So I'm looking at a meadow. Well, I'm just going to ask two questions altogether. Does the county or the USDA or Fish and Wildlife, are they working on like range management plans with the people that are doing cattle and livestock to manage the flow of the creeks and to prevent things like the head cutting or the bank cutting? And then also, if you could talk a little bit more about the cutting into, and how that affects maybe the water table or the hydrology.
Okay, so I'm looking at, in terms of your first part of your question, we have environmental assessments that we are doing. We've had some pretty active and they got pushed aside for a while, but they'll be popping back up again, so look for them in the paper. And these are on our allotment management plans. So I don't see any activity for a couple months, but we will be putting things back into the paper. And if you were involved in the last comment period was probably 2 years ago, and we went through a lot of changes. Things got tabled. So yes, we do look at that, and we go through an environmental analysis to look at those things. And then we come up with plans on how we are going to best meet all of the responsibilities that we have, including providing grazing and permits. So in terms of what happens in that meadow system that had the meandering stream and the interaction of surface water to the floodplain, when you have a high energy system, it's usually lots of water. That's what I mean by high energy. Lots of water coming through your system. Somehow the vegetation and the terrain have evolved through time to an equilibrium that allows deposition or erosion. So erosion is normal within a range. The photo that I showed of the 16-foot deep gully, that was outside of the natural range of variability for that meadow to handle that much energy. And we believe, we're not sure, but we believe that water was concentrated either with a road or from ditching. And instead of water being distributed along like a meander, now that's a low slope system, but you can still have a lot of water go through. If it's not able to reach its floodplain, it will cut down. And when it cuts down, of groundwater follows the lowest exposed surface. So if you have cutting, groundwater's going to drop. And that's what happened to Trout Creek. So those soils were wet at one time, and what we found was that it's a multi-thread system with not one channel that goes through it, but many channels. And they get up out of the channel and they spread out, and they fill up with sediment and they move over here, and it's a very dynamic system.
So Trout Meadow used to be a wet meadow, and because of the lack of grading or whatever.
Trout Creek is a wet meadow, and it was cut down, and we have a large pond project out there right now called the Pond and Flood Project. And we're going to be working on it, trying to get it to function on its own, because we don't want to be out there any longer than we have to be. And so it was a meadow system that was up high, and the gullies tend to create their own slope. They look for the fastest, most efficient way to get down a hill slope, and that's straight. So if you can imagine a meandering channel like this, if you took that same difference in length, and you took that energy that was dissipated along that length, and then you put it all into one short, straight drop, that's a lot of energy for one spot. So that's what happened at Trout Creek. Yeah.
What caused the ridge erosion?
Well, we think it was roads concentrating runoff, and actually the road capturing that runoff from the stream channel. Or there's evidence of ditching out there. So if there were sheep herders out there, it's real common for sheep herders in the old days to dry out meadows.
So there was a road that cut right straight across the meadow?
Well, actually, the road itself may not have cut across the meadow, but as soon as that water got concentrated on the road, and then it spilled off the road and onto the meadow, then there's no channel there. It's all the water going to one spot. And so that will tend to, if there's any kind of break in the slope, it will start undercutting that slope, and it will work its way straight up slope. Just gravity.
So you have to be careful when you
Yeah.
Well, and the culverts too are terrible.
Yeah.
Right?
I have a question about if you could just describe a bit more the decisions that you make regarding the boundary of the meadow. When you're talking about conifer encroachment, I'm assuming it's pretty obvious when you just have a few conifers encroaching here and there. You still have a lot of the meadow grasses and forbs to be able to know which ones to take out. But when you have a lot of conifer encroachment, how do you decide how large of an area you're going to turn into a meadow? How are you deciding where that boundary is?
Yeah, well, we had people like myself and other foresters with twice as much experience as I have out there, and what we looked for was there's an age difference. So if I can go back here, let's see if I can see it. Thank you. Go back. Right there.
Go that one.
Yeah, that would be good. So the trees that were, if you could see these overstory pines, we figured that there's actually a little bit of a break in slope. We looked at age difference primarily. So these would have been the ones that were established after the lake was started in the 60s. And these trees were, like I said, anywhere from 35 to 40 years old, where these overstory trees are not. And so we tried to just keep it where there was an age break. And then there is, we did leave, you can see here, these smaller, shorter trees that are about 35, 40 years old, but they were kind of up in that stand, and we didn't want to disturb that. So that's how we did that. And then also followed the grass line.
Kathleen, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, when it comes to meadow restoration of a place that has so much public access, what does that really mean for meadow restoration that we try to do on our own? Maybe it matters that it's not a wet meadow and it is a dry meadow. I just think of meadow ecosystems as being rather sensitive, and humans love to check things out. And there's not like a specific path for them to walk down.
There is, and we are establishing that because there's a document that I referenced that's an agreement from 1983. And we have to, by Fish and Game regulation, or I don't know if you'd say regulation, but that agreement, we have to manage that North Shore for deer. It was part of the mitigation in the original environmental impact report to do that lake.
Yeah,
so wet meadows we're more familiar with, but dry meadows also play a role in deer ecosystem maintenance as well. And usually dry meadows, they're not as lush as say a wet meadow because obviously there's a water restriction, but wet meadow or dry meadows usually have a soil change, hence the reason it's a meadow and it can't support trees. And usually it's a soil change where it's a more porous soil, such as the case with that area, and which then allows for a lot more leaching of nutrients.
I don't know if you understood my question.
I don't know if I did either.
My question is more or less, is there a certain resilience to dry meadows that allow them to be trampled on by the public versus wet meadows for restoration purposes?
No.
I mean, is that a concern at all?
It is a concern. And that's partly, I don't know if you, I know where you're going now. That's partly why on this side here, there is this road and it's chain link fenced because back before the chain link fence, people used to drive out there. But there is trails that are starting to be developed, so people just go around the perimeter or up on this trail and up around. But that is going to be developed as this meadow restores itself. That is one of the mitigations, is that this area has to be managed for deer as its primary function.
And maybe that's a question for the county. Has the county considered kiosks for information about kind of these interesting things that people would like to learn about and would be really helpful for the space itself in terms of our stewardship of it as a community?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
And maybe, go ahead.
Okay. You know what? I just put in an order for almost $3,000 in signs.
Yeah.
I'm glad you asked me that question because that is a real problem. But besides that, it's important to know, it's important to us to not over signage that area. I mean, we don't want it to look like an LA freeway, so we try to put signs on. Unfortunately, there's a lot of popularity with our signs. They get stolen a lot. So we put signs up, you go back the next day and they're gone. But in this particular case, and I don't want to, step over Daniel in any way, but when we talked about the boundary, I hope this maybe answers a little bit of your question. As you know, there's a trail that we developed that goes right inside this area right in here. It loops up around and it comes around. You can see the trail there. We talked about, what Danielle knows and where this boundary should be. And we felt as a county or as a flood control district that it was important that particular area have some shaded breaks. So there is some diversity in it for the folks that use it recreational-wise. Because you're right, there's people running out across there, there's dogs and everybody else. We're getting horses out there. It's a challenge.
Yeah.
But we try to do our best to work within the prescription, but yet still give flexibility for all uses.
And maybe Heidi might want to speak to Panther Meadows, which is another well-loved meadow, as we all know, about what was done there.
So, yeah, that's a good example of a method that I used at Panther Meadow to develop, and this is a terrible term, sorry, it's that people suckers.
People what?
Suckers. And the idea, and help me come up with something better. People magnets there, people magnets. It came from a fish biology friend of mine, and the idea is that you create something that is a magnet for people that is safe for the meadow. So what we did at Panther was we created large stepping areas that people They like to go in groups, in small groups, and they like to stand in the meadow, which is very sensitive. And they like to set up photography equipment, have their dogs, they'll, come and camp out, they'll meditate. So how can we make this work with thousands and thousands of people that visit this area? So we developed a trail that actually has a French drain that runs under it to maintain the connectivity between the upslope groundwater and the downslope groundwater. So there's actually a series of these French drains that are blocked by sills, and this is all natural material, native material to the area. And that water is forced from the upslope subsurface to the downslope subsurface. But people walk and they stay on stones for the most part, and they're almost flat, and that's the magnet sucker part. You got to make it like you want to go sit there, and if you have a choice between a sharp rock and flat rock, you're going to go over the flat rock. So it's been really, and we have little pullouts for people to gather, and we're actually building another trail. We're almost finished with that trail, and another crossing, so people will be able to be on the periphery and look in versus being in and trampling. And we could do better with our signage. We have signs up there, but everyone gets a lot of education from our volunteers, and the Bioregional Ecology Center provided us with a paid volunteer last year. I'm not sure what's happening this year. So that's a big part of it, is that initial peer education. And then we're able to people like us can say, hey, you know what? That trail, it's really the best place to be for people.
And I just wanted to add one quick thing too to finish up. Those trees too, I don't know if you remember me saying, they were a lot of those, if not predominantly, there was western gall rust in those meadow trees. We don't have a lot of that around the lake, so that was another reason why we decided to remove those trees, as well as we're under prescription from Fish and Game. But the meadow is dry, but those trees too, you gotta remember, trees suck up water. On average, depending on the species and the size of the tree, those trees suck up anywhere from 1 to 500 gallons of water per tree per day. So don't be surprised if you go out there and that meadow will be wetter than what you're typically used to.
I had a question up here, and then Carrie, and then Bruce.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, back to the choices you made about trails and about trees to remove in the trail. So one of the things that interests me is maintaining the aesthetic of the trail, and part of that is retaining some of the shade adjacent to the trail. And I noticed it right along the edge there. You pulled out some of the trees on the south side. Yeah. I was just wondering, because the trail is somewhat.
This trail right here was pretty much already.
The trail that's right.
This one that goes up through here. Right. Yeah, this one. The actual trail itself, we try to keep under a few existing conifers, but where it's exposed, like through here, we didn't remove a whole lot. So we considered it, but it's hard to balance. How do I say this? It's hard to balance the management of all aspects of what we have to consider on every single acre out there, because I can't. It's a balancing act, and while we did try to maintain shade, on the trail, we did what we could, and then where it was exposed, it is what it is.
Right. Well, I noticed that there were some trees that that would have been a nice one to leave. So again, wondering, I guess the importance, I think, of this big asset to our community is, this trail and the nice duff that's created by the pine needles underneath for walking on, and just kind of retaining that.
Yeah, the duff actually inhibits the grass, though, which was the goal of the meadow. Is they're kind of a mutually exclusive.
Right. Well, I'm just talking about immediately adjacent to the trail.
There was, if I could just add one thing, you know, when we were in there too, there was some trees that were starting to get bug hits in them. And if they were perfect trees and we didn't think they were going to die, you know, a few years down the road, we ended up taking them out because we didn't want the bugs to spread to other trees. So there were some in that area, I think, if I remember right, up there from that Willow Creek where you swing back around and then you just kind of head straight toward North Shore, that we took out a couple extra 3 or 4 trees in there that we had bugs in, that if they were in good condition, we would have left them. But we're just trying to get these things out of there because we don't want any more trees to die.
Yeah, and the bugs are starting, especially with the drought we're having last year and especially this year. You're going to see a lot more bug-killed trees out at Lake Siskiyou. It's just, you know, the trees by large part are overcrowded. Overcrowded trees are competing for each other for nutrients and water, and water-stressed trees don't have enough sap production to fight insects, disease, etc. So we're starting to see that already.
Go on to Carrie.
I guess what I'm trying to figure out here is the stand you cut out is 27, 30 years old, which is about the time the lake was put in, the sand began to grow. And it doesn't look like what you talk about meadows being encroached. The whole place just grew trees.
No, that was encroachment. There was.
Yeah, but nonetheless, let me finish my thought. It looks to me like the whole, what Mother Nature or whoever you want to accuse of this is trying to do there is reestablish a forest, and that's what was happening. Now, I'm not trying to say that I'm opposed to meadow restoration in favor or anything. It's just that it looks to me like what if you were to leave that as a succession of what's happened, that would just go back to the forest. I think there's no question of that, right?
No question.
So you're trying to not restore a meadow, but create a meadow.
No.
And I want to make sure that, well, I don't want to make sure, I just want to raise the question, how certain are you that you just want to let it go? I mean, that's what Randy just said. He said, we're not going to do anything active there. Why, how do you know that this is going to succeed? That since I believe that area was part of the ranch, it was probably hayfield. And you're wanting to create a meadow out of that. It seems to me you have, there's a little bit of wishful thinking there, in that it might be better to just think a little more about what it was and what you want and how to get there, because I think if you just walk away from it, which as Randy has said, that you're just going to let it naturally regenerate, it'll regenerate back to the forest.
Yes, it would, and that is natural forest succession. Is things go from a disturbance where there's an opening to forest, and then we typically have another disturbance, and then there's another opening. One other reason why I know there was disturbance there is because there's aspen out in that meadow. Aspen would not have been in that meadow had there been. No, there's an aspen out there. I've got a picture of it. I can show you.
Well,
and there's
willows. Disturbances.
Yeah, but
once or twice a year.
yeah, but what you're failing to recognize, and I think this is the big thing, is that you are exactly right. Meadows and other areas that are openings will slowly convert, or what we call forest succession, to a forest until there's yet another disturbance that puts it back into what we would consider an early seral state, which is like the initial opening. But we've done two things as a society. First, we've suppressed wildfire. Fire kept these openings open. It kept this forest stand open. We have more trees per acre historically here than what we would have pre-European settlement. So we've suppressed fire, which would have, instead of logging those trees, would have burned those trees. So we are mimicking fire, if you will. And then the second point is, as far as letting it go and instead of like, I assume like actively replanting with native seed, Forest Service, other companies that do meadow restoration, that's just typically what happens is nature typically heals itself, and we don't want to act, and this is under direction of Fish and Wildlife as well, we don't want to act until we have to, because at this point we're going to let it go. And am I correct?
Yeah, and you know, this area 2, 3, 4 years from now is going to be lush grasses, flowers, and you know, some of these species are going to be inhabiting it. It's going to be very beautiful. Right now, you know, there has a little bit of growth.
Do you absolutely know that for certain?
Well,
Maybe we should look at some of my slides.
yeah, I mean, it's projects that, yeah, she's worked on and we've worked on, and it's something that we've actively made.
Carol, while you're
Most
going through that,
discussion I heard was about meadows. Is that right?
If I can, while Carrie's looking for slides, I have access, and we've been doing meadow restoration I'm a wildlife biologist and work for a resource company. And we've been doing these kind of projects for over 10 years now. And there's a lot of uncertainty in this room, a lot of questions. I'm more than happy to take anybody here out on a Saturday or Sunday to old projects we've done, projects that are proposed to be done this year. You can see exactly the line we pick, where we put our flags for this is a forest, this is a meadow. I can take you to areas that look like these hillsides up here, that there's 50 or 100 years ago, I can guarantee you was aspen stand, because there's one skeletal aspen left out there, and it probably used to be acres of aspen, and now it's nothing but ponderosa pine. Just some of the ways we look at things to figure out where we do these and how we do these. So if that's of interest to anybody, I'm more than happy to, through Kara, to organize a trip like that if people are interested.
I've done restoration projects that's like this also for over 20 years.
Lots of people
With the
have.
Forest Service.
Yeah.
And I know,
It's not
I will agree, if you don't maintain that every year, you'll fail.
You don't have to do it every year. I mean, fire was a spy.
Okay, let's talk about my.
Actually, we don't have very much time right now, so I just want to get to what Heidi was saying,
Okay, so
and then we'll take Bruce's question.
let's look at the research. So what the research does say is that if you don't maintain it, you will get a forest. And going in and removing that conifer as frequently as you can is a lot easier than coming back in with a large piece of heavy equipment and doing it again. So, you know, we use the inmates, the CAL FIRE inmates, they do a great job. I take them for a day and they're done in 2 hours. It's just like, you know, they just go right through it. So it's any kind of maintaining that, getting that conifer out frequently, constantly is really important for the success of that meadow. The research that I've seen, we actually have more data and more results than one of the papers that I can give you a reference on conifer encroachment in meadows. And they looked at harvest, and they looked at fuel after harvest, or broadcast burning after harvest. So they looked at just harvest, and then they looked at harvest plus burning. And they looked at an 8-year time period, and within that time period, they did not see an effect from fire. So they were basically saying you could just get the same results. So our cycle is a little bit longer, and I would definitely use fire if you have that option, even on a small scale, very controlled, because it just rejuvenates the grasses, and it provides a lot more quick cycling. So we're going to be, working towards more and more meadow restoration. And there is, I think it is really important not to know everything. We cannot walk in there and assume we know everything. And that's why I took that slide up. It is more complex than you can think.
And I'm sorry to really cut this short. Unfortunately, we're reaching time. I know Bruce had a question after that. You know, there might be some time for the speakers to speak on a one-to-one basis, but we'll just finish up really quickly with Bruce's question.
Yeah, my question is a little bit related to Carrie's, I think, so I mean, we've gone over some of it, but I was just wondering whether the soil scientists or botanists who looked at this were reasonably sure that because of a dry meadow, I think it's just kind of maybe less what we think about it, as opposed to just a clearing in the forest. Like how certain are you that it's naturally going to regenerate as what people think of as a meadow, like grasses and wildflowers, as opposed to a shrub field, say bitterbrush and ceanothus, and that would all, you know, my cynical side would say, all that would still meet your agency's need to have deer habitat because they want, like, you know, that's still good forage, but maybe selling a shrub field restoration project wouldn't go over with the public as well as a meadow restoration. So how do you know it's going to be a meadow rather than just a shrubs?
There is no 100% guarantee, and I'm not going to stand here and say I 110% know it's going to. I know there's grasses there, and we're trying to propagate them and give them the best habitat that we know they need. But that's partly why we try to limit the ground disturbance, because we don't know what's in that buried seed. And you know, like ceanothus, manzanita, that seed can live in that soil for a couple hundred years. And then a disturbance comes along and yeah, you've got a manzanita field. So we don't know, but we'll keep an eye on it.